In this lab, Excel assignment number 2, we're going to explore formulas in a bit more detail. We touched on it in Excel lab 1. Now in lab 2, we're going to use formulas. So again, our first step is we have to download the attached file from Blackboard. So I'm going to click on the file in Blackboard, and it's going to download it. If yours has the button at the top that it says Enable Content, make sure you click on that. Mine does not have that, but sometimes when you download from the internet, you'll have that button. You saw that in the previous lab. So if you're missing all these menu options to the top and you're confused as to why, look for that big button right about here where you see my mouse. The first thing we should always do is save the document. So first I'm going to save it with a new name. That way periodically throughout the exercise I can save it as I go. This one's a little bit longer than the previous exercise, so I'm going to make sure that I save it. So I'm going to call this one autosales_Brian. Doesn't matter what you call it, because when you turn it in to the system, it'll automatically tell me who turned it in. Now this one is already formatted for us. In the previous lab, we were worried about the formatting, but we don't have to do that in this assignment. It's already been done for us. So the first thing we're going to do is click on cell B2, which is the date. We're going to put the date here. Now you could just type the date in, but instead the instructions want us to use a formula to do that. So we're going to click on the Formulas tab. And in the Formulas tab, under Date Time, we are going to use now for the date time. So right here where it says now. So now we'll basically make sure that it always shows the current date and time. So there we go. So this is showing now, which is 2/26/2017 when I'm recording this video. So this spreadsheet is, the scenario here is you work for a car dealer and you're in charge of financing and you've got a little spreadsheet here. So a few things. First, we want to calculate the down payment. So I'm sure most of you have bought a car, maybe some of you have bought a car, but when you buy a car you have to give a down payment unless your credit is really good. If you've got really good credit, then sometimes they don't require a down payment. So in this column we have to put in the minimum down payment that we're requiring from each one of these customers. And you can see that there's a credit rating, so we know how good their credit is. And down here is the business rule. At the bottom is a little table here that gives us the business rule. So if their credit is a 750 or better, then they do not have to do a down payment. But if it's below a 750, we're going to require at least 10% for the down payment. So we're going to use a formula to do this. So I'm going to click on cell D5, and we're going to insert a new formula. So we're going to click logical in the function library group. So there's a logical formula. We're going to do if. So we're going to check if a value is true. So the way this works, first we're going to do a logical test to see if the value is true. If it's true, we're going to do one thing. And if it's false, we're going to do something else. So first, the logical test. Now think if you're doing this manually, you'll be thinking to yourself, my customer has a credit rating of 579, which I can see in column C. Is that higher than or less than 750? And then if it's higher than 750, I'm going to say no down payment. If it's lower than 750, maybe I'm going to say 10% down payment. In the textbook, they're going to tell you to type C5, which is, so C5 is the credit score. So if C5 is less than, and I'm just going to click on it, you can also just click on these fields, is less than E14. If that's true, so let's see here. So if that's true, we're going to multiply D14, which is the down payment amount, times 10%. There we go. So D14 times B5, so 10% times the purchase price. If it's false, we're just going to put 0 for the down payment. So if it's true, C5 less than E14. So C5 is right here. It's the credit rating. If the credit rating is less than the credit threshold, then we're going to multiply 10% times the purchase price. Otherwise, we're just going to use 0. So I'm going to click OK. And it did it correctly. Now here's the problem. Watch what happens when I click and drag to copy this. It doesn't work. The reason it's not working is take a look at what it did. Here, I'm checking if E14 right? If C5 is less than E14, but take a look at E14. E14 is right here. When I click the next cell, look what it did. It moved this to the next box, and then the next, and the next, and so forth. So it kept copying that reference. To prevent Excel from copying, from incrementing that reference when we do a copy, the syntax to do that is to put dollar signs in front of the E and the 14. So if you put a dollar in front of E and a dollar in front of 14, it tells Excel to lock in the location of that cell, to never move that around, which is great. That's one way you can do it. The other way you could do it, if you simply put your mouse on that cell in the formula and you hit F4, it automatically puts the dollar signs in front. And you can keep hitting F4 to toggle back to D14. So if you hit F4, it'll give you the dollar signs. So make sure your formula looks like this. You can either put the dollar signs manually in front of each, or you can hit F4 to insert the dollar signs. Once you do that, hit Enter. And then we're going to copy that formula. And now it works. Now we see the correct amounts. So this customer, for example, doesn't need to make a down payment, neither does this one. And the rest of these customers, it shows the down payment amount that's required. One other thing that we need to do here when we copied these, when you highlight these cells, you'll see this little tiny box appear on the bottom right. That's the autofill options. If you notice, we lost the formatting on the bottom when we copied that cell. To keep that from happening, we're going to click that little down arrow and we're going to say fill without formatting. And that should allow us to keep that double border if we did it the first time. If you don't have that double border though, don't worry about this. We can always add that later on. All right, now we're going to get the amount financed. This is pretty simple. We did this already in the previous lab. Equals, because it's a formula. We're simply going to take the purchase price and subtract from the down payment. So your formula will be equals B5 minus D5. And then you'll copy that one as well. Once again, I'm going to fill without formatting. And that's it. So let's move on to the next step. Now this next part's a little bit more complicated. Here, we have to calculate the percentage rate for each client. Now, as you probably know, when you apply for a loan, one of the things that probably the biggest factor in the rate that you're going to pay, in the APR, the percentage for the loan, is your credit score. So you can see here, we have a little table that tells us if a client's credit score is between 500 and 650, they pay 4%. Once they hit 650, it drops to 3.5%, then 3.25%, then 3%, then 2.75%, and finally 2.25% if their credit score is an 850 or better, which is a pretty high credit score. So we have to show that here. We have to calculate their rate from this table. Now, theoretically, we could do this with the if function, which we learned about previously. So I used the if function for the down payment. But that would be a lot of if statements. We would have to check if the credit score is this, then check if it's this, then check if it's over this, then check if it's greater than this, then it's greater than this, and greater than that. And theoretically, you could do that, but there's an easier way to do it, and that's the Vlookup function. So we're going to click on on cell F5, and in the function library, again, I'm still in the formula tab. In lookup and reference, we're going to do a Vlookup or a vertical lookup. So it's all the way down here at the bottom. We're going to do a Vlookup. You get the little wizard that pops up. All right, so first, let me look at the instructions here. So for the lookup value, that's going to be cell C5, right? That's their credit score. So that's what we're checking against is their credit score. For the table array, this is going to be from A14 to B19. So I'm going to click on A14 down to B19. So I'm clicking that table. So I selected this entire table. Now, before we move on, if you recall, when we did the if statement before, when we copied the formula down, there were certain things that we did not want to increment. So if we copy this formula from cell F5, where we are right now, to cell F6, the C5, we want to go to C6. We want that to increment. But for the table array, we want that to stay locked into that little table that we just drew. So I'm going to highlight A14 and hit F4, and B19 and hit F4, and that's going to lock it in to that table so it doesn't move that reference. So for the column index number, so the column index number in this case is going to be 2. So it's going to use the value that it finds in column 2. So the column 1, the first column, is the value that it's is where it's looking for the lookup value, and then the index is column 2. That's where we want it to substitute the value that it finds in column 2. In this case, 0.04, right? Because 579 is between 500 and 650, so we know it should get a 4% APR. So that's actually working correctly. In this little preview, it shows us. So once you fill in this table, or this little wizard here, the function argument, we're going to click OK, and it shows the percent. And we're going to click and drag, and it's going to copy the percent. And that's it. So now we've got our APRs for each client. You can see it's correct. This customer has an 827, so their credit rate's going to, or their APR is going to be 2.75%, which is pretty low. This customer here at the top has kind of a low credit rating, so their APR is 4%, the highest credit rating. So it makes sense. So we were able to complete that without having to do a whole bunch of if statements. Now I want to show you a different way that you can do this. Not necessarily a different way, but I think a way that might be a little bit easier than having to type in or having to get this entire table. So one of the options you have in Microsoft Excel is to name a table value. So when you click and highlight, now notice I'm not in any wizards right now, so I don't have the Vlookup function up yet, but I'm going to click and drag to highlight this range of values. I'm going to name that range. So at the very top, I'm going to go up here where it says A14 with this still selected, and I'm going to call it APR underscore table. And then I'm going to click enter. And now I've named this range. So this little table has a named range now. So now if I go up to rate, I'm going to do the same thing I did before. I'm going to go in here, do Vlookup. For the lookup value, I'm going to do C5. But for the table array, I'm going to type APR table instead. And then it's still index on column 2. Click OK. Now notice this looks a lot simpler now. It just says APR table, and it will implicitly always lock that in place. So let me click and drag this to copy it, and I have the same results. So finally, our last step is we have to calculate the client's payment, assuming that they make the down payment that we've recommended. In this case, 10% for this customer, 0 for this customer. Now remember, customers could always make a higher down payment, but in this case, if they make a down payment, that's the minimum that we're requiring. We're going to figure out what their payments are going to be for the life of the loan. So let's figure that out using a formula. So once again, we have some lookup values for this. We know that there are 12 payments per year, so they're monthly payments, which makes sense. Most people make payments monthly for a car. And the total number of payments is 60, which means these are for a 5-year loan. So we're assuming that all of these purchases are for a 5-year loan. They're going to make payments 12 times a year. Microsoft Excel makes this really easy to calculate. We're going to click on on cell G5. We're going to go to Financial Formulas. And the one that we're going to use is PMT, which is short for payment. It's in alphabetical order. So here it is right here. So we're going to click on PMT, which calculates the payment for a loan based on constant payments and a constant interest rate. And that's usually how car loans work. Credit card payments are a little more complicated, but car loans, pretty straightforward. So for the rate we know is going to be in the preceding column. So in this case, F5, right? So here's my rate right here. The N per value is going to be column E, or I'm sorry, the value in E17. And remember, we want to hit F4 to put the dollar signs in front of that. Okay, so N per turns into 60. The PV column is going to be minus E5. Okay, so minus E5, so we're just taking the negative value of the amount financed. That's how much they have to pay back on the loan. So the amount they're paying back over time. So over a period of 60 payments, they are going to pay back $21,075 in this case. For FV, oh, you know what? We don't need an FV in this function, so we do not need the FV. So I'm going to click OK. And I have $931.57. So I'm going to click and drag. Again, I get the little pound signs here because it's too large to fit in there. I can just double click and it'll extend that column a little bit. Good Lord, that's an expensive car payment. This doesn't look right to me. So these payments seem awful high, don't they? To find out why, let's do a little sanity check. So when we click on this column, when we click on the value, if you look at the top, okay, so we have our formula up here. One thing I want to show you is formulas can have lots of arguments. So this is the formula name, and then each one of these inside the parentheses is the argument. What's nice about this is when you click on each argument in the formula, which are separated by commas, by the way, at the bottom it shows you a nice little hint about what each one of those are. So you can see there are three arguments here. There's the rate, the N per, and the PV. And if I click on rate, it highlights the value that I used for rate. Now, if you think about this for a minute, there's something wrong here. One thing that you have to take into account with a loan is the time of the loan, the time over a period of a year or whatnot. So here I just put the rate as F5, but that can't be right. The rate is 4% per year, not 4% per payment. But the way this payment was calculated is a 4% rate per payment. So we have to subtract F5. So it's going to be divide F5 by 12 payments. So the rate per month is not 4%. The rate per year is 4%. That's the yearly rate. So we have to divide it by the number of payments per year. So I'm going to add divide. I'm going to click on payments per year. Once again, I need to lock in that number of payments per year, so I'm going to hit F4 on the D17 to put the dollar signs in front of it. Now I'm going to hit enter. And that looks like a much more reasonable car payment. $388.13 is pretty affordable for a $23,000 car if I had a 579 credit rating. Likewise, if I had a pretty good credit rating and I was buying a $42,000 car, $759.96 is probably a bit more affordable. Though to me, that seems like an awful high car payment, but that is the correct answer. Finally, you can see we have these yellow fields, which are kind of a placeholder for something. What we want here is the total purchase price, so a sum of all the purchase prices. So one way to do that is we can go to the auto sum and simply click on sum, and then click enter. So we can see that $186,000 is how much all of this financing is worth. Over here for the amount financed, instead of doing a sum, we're going to do an average. So once again, you can click on auto sum, but this time we're going to click on average. Notice that it automatically populates the argument with the range for the average. Excel's pretty smart. It knows that you probably want to get an average for all the values that are above. So I'm going to click on enter, and I've got my average. So our average amount financed is $29,000, and the total amount financed, or the total amount of cars that we've sold with financing, is $186,000. That's it. Once you're done, you're going to click on File, Save, and then you're going to upload it for your submission for this unit.